Hey guys, welcome to Tuesday night Bible study. We are studying in depth the book of Philippians, chapter 1, verse by verse, and chapter by chapter. And these are good. As you know, my passion is teaching strictly the Bible. That's why mostly I do that, to teach the Bible verse by verse, chapter by chapter. And the one thing is, it's not that there are other venues where I do different topics and things like that. And certainly there are a lot of what's called topical teachings out there. And excuse me, topical teachings where you take subjects, of course, from the Bible, and you teach on them. I want to say probably most Bible teaching, sermons and all that comes from are topical. What's called topical. Sermons are topical. Okay, and that's fine as long as, to me, they are true to what the Bible says. Too often we develop sermons, teachings, theologies from scriptures that the verses have nothing to do with the topic, or is not what it's saying. So I think this is why I think it's important, and especially pastors and ministers. I'm a firm believer that every pastor who shepherds a church should somewhere in their program, their curriculum, I know it's not the right word, curriculum, but somewhere, midweek Bible study, whatever, that they are teaching verse by verse through the entire Bible. How else can you say you have given your people the whole counsel of God, as Paul said in Acts chapter 20? And not only that, but when we are teaching, and though you also not so much teaching, but also just reading book by book, verse by verse, right? Chapter by chapter. When you're reading, you're getting what God wrote, instead of how for some reason, we think we can extract meanings out. And oftentimes, we're not always, extracting meanings out of excuse me, that we're not always extracting the right meanings. In other words, it can be easy to make scripture say what you wanted to say. I'll give you an example of that right now. The Bible, Judas hung himself. Flip over a couple of pages. Go do likewise. That's a good. Look, people do that, and oftentimes there are people that, but I think what is being robbed mostly is when you do not understand why did the writer of a particular book write the letter. Why didn't he? Why didn't he write the letter? So anyway, we've been in Philippians chapter 1. And the Tuesday night Bible studies are in depth, so we kind of slow it down. And we kind of really take a look at these verses, and I think it is important. Now, let me just say, going back to what the theme of Philippians. Let me kind of go back. I'm going to do this from time to time. Look at verse 1 again. Paul and Timothy, slaves of Christ Jesus. I just wanted to read that because this kind of, when you start off, how the writer starts off the letter, kind of gives us a flavor of how the message is going. What's the point of the message, right? And Paul said, instead of Paul, for example, if you look at this in comparison to Paul's opening to the book of Galatians, where he's quite forceful. Paul, an apostle by the will of God. Okay, so there was a point. There was a reason why he stressed that point. That's later brought out in the letter. Here, he doesn't say that he doesn't use his title as an apostle, but say a slave. When he says Paul and Timothy, slaves of Jesus Christ. Now, this word slavery was normal. We cannot, I put it like this, we should not look at slavery from the perspective of our culture, the American, and then thus the American slave trade. We shouldn't look at it from that perspective. The American slave trade was something different. Race came into play with the American, or I put it like this, the Atlantic slave trade. Race came in. It was one of the first times that a specific or race was used. And race, it was targeted, one particular race of people was targeted for slavery. During this time, slavery was common. There were different forms of slavery. Now, slavery is slavery because pretty much all forms of slavery is dehumanizing. So it's all bad. And in fact, one of the things that's mentioned in the book of Revelation is in respect to the judgment is this idea. I think we may find this in Revelation chapter 17 and 18 when it talks about the collapse of the financial system of the world, the evil world, that's called Babylonia. And one of the things that's mentioned is the selling of souls, the buying and selling of souls that's condemned. But there were different kinds of slavery during this time. Pretty much, I think at least a quarter of the Roman population, I've even heard other reports, maybe even 2/3, but at least a quarter of the population of the Roman Empire were slaves. And that's probably, I could say, it's probably a lower figure. But and slavery was quite simple. If you were conquered, you pretty much was going to be a slave. That's how that, Now, so like when you think about the Roman Empire that was around for centuries, right? Centuries. Then, of course, there were people who were then born into slavery, which means they had no rights. They were not recognized as, they wasn't recognized as people, so they didn't have rights. And of course, the different structure of the Roman Empire, because a citizen was something different altogether. So a lot of the people, so when Rome conquered someone, and by the way, and throughout history, when you was conquered, you pretty much was a slave, and they did with you whatever they want. All right. So by using this term slave, the writers of the New Testament, the term was bond slave. Okay, a bond slave. And what is interesting about this term, and of course in our culture, our mind, we will find this repulsive, right? The notion of this. But the term bond slave, in fact, even in the Hebrew scriptures, under the law, there was a provision for being a bond slave. In the Hebrew, under Israel, and when we come to this subject of slavery, let me just say this. This is one of these I can't give an answer. In other words, why did God allow slavery? I can answer it from a New Testament perspective more so than an Old Testament perspective. New Testament is quite clear why God allowed slavery. Why God told the Christians, if they were slaves, to submit to their slave masters. The same reason why he told wives to submit. Same reasons why he even told children to submit. The reason why is because of the witness. Now, I'm not going to get into a long, drawn-out discussion on that. If you read 1 Peter chapter 2, you will see Peter brings that out. In other words, see, you're put in a position. See, when you're put in a position where people can watch you, that's God's aim, and he was using all means. So he would say to the slave masters, treat your slaves right, and then to the slaves, submit to your masters. Again, same reason when he said, wives, submit to your husbands, and then husbands, love your wives. All of that was to showcase and adorn the gospel of God. That's the reason in the New Testament. The Old Testament, I can't give a reason for that, because God could have ended slavery, right? He could have said, no slaves. Israel, for you, no slaves. But he basically regulated slavery. Okay, so I can't answer that. It's something when we get to heaven you can ask the Lord, but I cannot give. I just can't. But one of the provisions, excuse me, I think under Israel you could not buy and sell Hebrew slaves. Now, the other kind of slavery then was called debtor slavery. So if someone could not pay their debt, then they had to work it off. That was called indentured or debtor slavery. So Israel could not buy and sell a slave as a Hebrew Israelite. But God's attitude pretty much was, well, if they was outside of Israel, okay, yeah, you can buy and sell. No regulations there. Now the other, like I say, and that's a bitter pill to swallow. Again, because God could have said to Israel, right, no slavery, period. Okay. But the provisions that if you worked as a slave and then it came time for you to be free, and there was some, again, under the Old Testament, there was some kind of weird regulations. So, for example, if you were a slave and you were working towards your freedom, but you had children born in while you was under the slavery, the children belonged to the master. Like I say, can't answer that. That's a bitter pill to swallow, because God could have said no slavery. Anyway, and I say that. Let me also say this. So why the fact that God allowed, I kind of open this one. Let me answer this question too, because I can't give an answer in terms of why God allowed slavery. Especially coming from our culture, that's a bitter pill to swallow. So I cannot say why. But let me just say this. Does that mean or disqualify God from being God? No, it doesn't. It just means, Lord, I don't understand that decision. It just simply means you're still God. Now, if you want to say, well, I'm not going to serve God because, he allowed slavery. Well, you got bigger issues, period. Because regardless, he's still God. Think about your job. Think about government, right? These people in authority do things all the time that we don't agree with. They do things all the time that may be even right or wrong that we don't agree with. But you can't say, well, I'm going to rebel against you. That's not right. So my point is, when we come to these kinds of issues where I don't know why, right? I don't know why God allowed slavery. However, he's still God. No more than I can say, well, Lord, I don't understand why don't you stop the evil today, right? Because he's not stopping evil today doesn't mean he's less God. If you say, well, Lord, I don't understand why, my loved one didn't get healed. Why did you let them die? Well, the fact that he let them die doesn't mean that he's not God. It just means you don't understand the reason. And he's still God. And if you say, well, I'm not going to serve God because of these reasons, right? You got bigger issues. Because remember, there isn't an entire eternity out there. He's still God. All right. So with that said, then the bond slave, even if he could get his freedom, in other words, hey, you're free to go. But he might say, well, but I love my master. And this is kind of the illustration that Paul is using right here. This is, again, in the Old Testament. He says, I love my master and I want to serve him forever. I want to serve him for life. They would bring him to the authorities. They would pierce his ears, wring blood. And then he was surrendering his will to the will of his master. So that's the image that the Christian writers are borrowing from. That we surrender our wills to Jesus. That's what they mean by bond slave. Now this is important too, because you may think I'm not just going off here, but I want to keep this thought, because this is why Paul is writing this. Now keep in mind that he's writing this, and this is again our service while we're here, our service, because he's writing this. The same writer, remember, wrote, we are sons of God. We are heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ. Okay, so in fact, in chapter 3, it's even going to give us another little gem about our bodies, that we're going to have bodies like that of Jesus. So our eternity, man, great, right? But while we're here, if you think about this, we talked about this last week. Why are we here? With the promises of God that we have. Why are we here right now? Wouldn't it be easier? Wouldn't it be easy to just go to heaven? People, it's funny because the stress level of people vary, right, accordingly. If you think about, there are some people that go through hell. But then there are people who fall apart because, the world ends to them because their bank account went from millions down to, we only have a couple of $100,000 in the bank. And I kid you not, there are people who have committed suicide over that. We only got $200,000 in the bank. So it's all kind of relative how we kind of view that. But the idea is that so the thing is, why are we here? Wouldn't it be easier to, whatever it is, the stress and the just putting up with the evil, just putting up with evil. We always have to be on guard, right? So in that respect, why not just go to a place, right? In our case, go home to heaven, where we will never ever have to worry about that ever again, right? So here's my point: why are we here? So why are we here? Put a pin in that, because we're going to come back to that. Knowing that we have these precious promises, but yet here, while we're here, we are to serve, right? And this is why Paul says, bond slaves. We surrender our will to the will of God. We surrender our entire will to the will of God. We're bond slaves. All right, so Paul then writing to the Philippians. The city of Philippians was a Roman colony. Now, this kind of adds some other layers to this. The city of Philippi was a Roman colony. And what that meant was there were colonies. And with the Roman, remember, the Roman Empire was vast. So it spread pretty much what we call the known world. Several continents, right? So the way Rome tried to manage its vast empire was they put garrisons, meaning military posts, right, in cities. But then they would also have what's called colonies. And these colonies were not only garrisons, but they were cities where even Roman citizens would move there. Sometimes they would get great incentives to move. But the city looked like Rome. So that whatever the culture was, Rome overtook it. Now, if you live in a big metropolitan area, one of the best examples of that, I know here, in Chicago area, in New York, in LA, in San Francisco for sure, they have Chinatown. And if you go to these sections of the cities, in those cities in particular, you will see that section of town the architecture looks like Chinatown. They have writings, the signage, all sometimes in Chinese. Usually can have duals, but in other words, it looks like Chinatown or China. It is very much Chinese. And that's the example. In other words, Rome wanted to have a representation to let the people know the Roman way, Rome is in charge. So the imagery there, we are a Christian colony. That the Christian church should reflect a heavenly citizenship. We should reflect that, and one of the sad things is that we don't, but we should. So last week when we talked about, remember he said and we'll get back to this, that later on there was fightings and strifes in this church that Paul is dealing with. Okay? And so he says, and I'm going to start here and reading this come up because the thought is continuous here. Let me start reading here at verse 12. Now, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has actually resulted in the advance of the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the world, the whole imperial guard, and to everyone else, that my imprisonment is in the cause of Christ. And that's important. That was extremely important to Paul, that they know that, hey, that I'm in prison not because I got caught stealing or, I wasn't out doing crime. Verse 14, most of the brethren in the Lord have gained confidence from my imprisonment and dare even to speak the message fearlessly. And this was one of the things that Paul was concerned with. Paul was very concerned about his imprisonment, how it may impact the people, but then he was pleasantly surprised that, again, it inspired people to be fearless in their faith. Verse 15, to be sure, some preach Christ out of envy and strife, but others out of goodwill. These do so out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. Verse 17, the others proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely seeking to cause me anxiety in my imprisonment. What does it matter? Just in every way, whether out of false motives or true, Christ is proclaimed. And in this I rejoice and will rejoice, because I know this will lead to my deliverance through your prayer and help from the Spirit of Jesus Christ. So again, one of the most interesting things is that you had people preaching the gospel, thinking that they were irritating Paul. That's kind of amazing when I think about that. When I think about, there are people out there that, and it shouldn't surprise me, religious people, their aim is not the heart of God. The Pharisees were one of the most religious groups of people. When I say religious, when you think of their piety, I'm going to say fake piety, but they did everything externally right. If you looked upon them, you would say, these men are holy. These men are, I could never compete with that. How could I measure up to them? The sad truth is, very well, because they were only show. And a good example was this. Remember, they coveted with, they paid Judas 30 pieces of silver to frame Jesus. Right? So for all of that talk of the law, keeping the law, was a fake to them. Right? How many laws doing Jesus' 3.5 year ministry, public ministry, did they break? They hated him. They plotted against him. They tried to turn people away from him. They tried to shame Jesus, right? So all of this, but yet while faithfully, meticulously keeping the law, they were careful to tithe precisely. If they had corn, if they had grain, if they had a bushel of apples, they would tithe it meticulously. But yet here they are. They paid, Judas 30 pieces of silver to betray not only an innocent man, but the Son of God. Okay? When Judas had his attack of conscience, and he came and he said, we have betrayed innocent man. Their response, that's your problem. Judas throws the 30 pieces of silver on the ground, and he goes and hangs himself. But the Pharisees, now think about this, one, and they knew Jesus was innocent. They knew Jesus was the Son of God. They knew Jesus was the prophet. They knew Jesus was the Messiah. They just rejected him. They knew, of course, by lying, framing Jesus, they were wrong. And yet, here is the thing. They took the 30 pieces of silver and they said, well, we can't put this money back into the treasury. That would be against God's law. So when you think about this, it's kind of like, what? You just framed an innocent man. You lied. In other words, just from their perspective, they lied, framed an innocent man, falsely had him arrested, falsely interrogated him, and then now they were having this man crucified. But yet they were meticulous about the law and say, we're not going to put this money back into the law. To the treasury. That would be against the law. See, that's the danger of religion. We have it today where people are doing things religiously, but they don't have really the heart of God. See, they don't have the heart of God. So, the fact that these guys could preach the gospel, not caring one, if they're actually reaching people. They didn't care if they was reaching people. Their aim for preaching the gospel was, let's irritate Paul. So Paul's response was classic to me. He says, let me go back because this is classic Paul. He says, verse 18, what does it matter, just in every way, whether out of false motives or true, Christ is proclaimed, and in this I'll rejoice. Now you should know something too, is what is kind of strange is that could God use them? Could God use that? Could God use their insincerity? Now that's kind of strange, interesting, because I think about this. Here they are preaching the gospel out of false motives. But yet, because they're preaching the gospel, people could come to the Lord. Think about that. People could come to the Lord. They couldn't, but people could come to the Lord. And just think about that for a moment. That people could come to the Lord. And you think about it like this, like, wow, people could come to the Lord. All right. So, anyway, people, he says, and this one I want to point out too, verse 19, let me go to verse 19, that's why I'm picking up. Verse 19, because I know this will lead to my deliverance through your prayer and help from the Spirit of Jesus Christ. So that statement here is going to help us to understand, and we talked about this last week. It's my eager expectation and hope is that I will not be ashamed about anything, but that now, as always, with all boldness, Christ will be magnified, or Christ will be highly honored in my body, whether by life and death. Now, if you know why I keep sometimes struggle with words, what I have to fight sometimes is quoting the King James. For years I read the King James Bible, so that's why almost instinctively I go into King James mode. This is the Holman Christian Standard Bible, and the Holman Christian Standard Bible it is a better translation. It's just that I'm so used to the King James. Notice now Paul says something here, and this is important. He says that my expectation, hope is that I will not be ashamed with anything. Now, meaning I'm not ashamed to be in jail. And remember, being in jail in any time frame is never pleasant. I never been to jail. I've been a chaplain in jail, having Bible study with people. Jail ministries to me are wonderful. Jail ministries are wonderful. However, when you're in jail, because I was actually in the cells with the guys, and we would have Bible study, and I could tell you that I was always glad I'm walking out. Okay, that's something about being in there. You know, you hear those doors slam and all that, just something. But and of course, our jails is wonderful. Paul's experience here, that as he is in prison writing this letter, as he's in prison, it is not a pleasant experience. They didn't go out their way to make sure he had air quality. So, for example, you go to jails, you got certain air quality. You know, they maintain a certain temperature. I'm going to guess 70 degrees, something like that, 70, 71, whatever. Okay, but at least they have that year round. See, year round, there's a whole maintenance crew, engineering crew, trades that takes care of the jail. They have lights, plumbing, right? So, and so that okay, you know, what do you think Paul's plumbing was? Again, they didn't build plumbing. So just think about that. Where do you think his plumbing was? Right there. He relieved himself right there. The stench probably was unbearable. And they had minimum heat during the winter. So to be in jail was unpleasant. But of course, even the stigma. In other words, if you went to jail, the assumption is you did something bad. So that means you were bad. So the fact that Paul is saying that now, and by the way, you had the same thing going on in Paul's day, where there were people who were living high off of the hog. They were living good. The Corinthian letter, if you go back and you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, one of the things you find about that letter to Corinthians, one of the things you find is that Paul did not take a salary from them. They were upset about that. And so when you kind of go through and you read, that comes out, especially in 2nd Corinthians. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he talks about, he says, I could have a wife, I could have a salary, I could live well. And he says there's nothing wrong with ministers living well. He says, I'm sacrificing these things, and especially to the Corinthian church, because they were hung up on money. Unlike the Philippian church, the Philippians were poor. They were struggling financially. But the Corinthian church, they were a well-to-do city, well-to-do church. And because of that, because they seem to be hung up on money, Paul said, I'm not taking money from you guys. And his reason is that so that there will never be any kind of obstacle. Okay? Any kind of obstacle about the gospel. Now, I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to give you a prime example of where you can see where Paul is coming from. One of the Black Lives Matter founder just bought her a house. And they paid like $1 million. I think she paid like $1 million for the house. And now she's getting all kinds of criticism. And it's kind of funny because what you have in this case, again, this kind of the same scenario here. And this is not a defense or a condemnation of Black Lives Matter. I'm just giving you a scenario. There are people who don't like Black Lives Matter because of the phrase itself, Black Lives Matter. The movement it is now a worldwide phenomenon. Right? You even had Quakers last summer saying Black Lives Matter. It just kind of amazing to see Quakers, little Quaker girls, right, saying Black Lives Matter. All over the world, though, all over the world. New Zealand, Australia, Russia, Black Lives Matter. I kid you not. It was amazing. And since then, they kind of really got established, and I think they have some endowments that total like $90 million. Okay? That kind of spawns some jealousy from people who didn't get the $90 million. That there were some people that, why are they getting all that money? There are Black Lives Matter leaders and those who are kind of associated with it, but they're not, that's getting some attention. Some, media attention. They're everywhere. And that kind of, again, sparks some resentment and jealousy from people. So when one of the founders purchased this home, well, where did she get this money? Where did she get this money? And then they want to go, well, see, she's squandering the $90 million, yada, yada, yada. And without even knowing the whole whatever. In other words, did she get a mortgage on it or did she pay cash? I didn't look into it. Let me just say this. That's why Paul would say, for example, I wouldn't do that. Because, see, now the media hype is a distraction from what her message would be. And again, I'm not pushing or not pushing. I'm not defending or condemning the Black Lives Matter organization or whatever. People, you got their opinion, and they're look on both sides. That's not what I'm here doing. What I'm saying is that if the fact that she purchased $1 million home, I mean, she had book deals. She's got other stuff going. So here's my point. So Paul would have said, I'm using this as an example. Paul would have said, well, I'm not gonna do that. Now Paul also would have said it's okay to do that. I'm not criticizing you guys for whatever endeavors that you're doing. Like some of the like I say, excuse me, some of the people on the media, things like that. Paul, okay. So same thing with ministers. There are ministers that are millionaires. Right? One of the things now, and some of these ministers, they are kind of foolish and silly because they get on and say just dumb stuff. You know, they sit on try to justify why they want to get a jet plane because they don't want to fly into a bunch of demons. I get the statement. And there was one guy who came up and he came up with a kind of a financial marketing scheme. You know, if 300,000 of my followers give I'm gonna do this math again because I always forget. Give $1,000, I believe it was, then I can get my $65 million jet. Let me see something here. I think it was, okay, so it was $1,000 times 300. Let's see if it's come up here. No, that didn't come up right. Anyway, I was trying to figure out. Anyway, he had this math where so many of his followers gave $1,000, I believe it was. That came up more. That he can get his $65 million jet. Now the point is that a lot of times these ministers don't have any shame about their lifestyle, because sometimes people ask, how could they sleep at night? They will tell you we sleep fine on our high thread count silk sheets or whatever, right? So while Paul would said, okay, fine, those guys are doing that, but Paul says, even though I could do that, because scripturally there's nothing wrong in the sense for those guys to be millionaires. There's nothing wrong scripturally to say that they fly in the jet. I would have said to the one guy, you did a PR, mistake. Or another guy that was talking about, the way your justification of getting the jet made it even worse. That you're too good to fly. And don't give me this stuff that you as a man of God need a long time with God. That's why you need to fly in your own jet. No, you don't. Plain and simple. No, you don't. Paul was in jail right here, praying. By the way, in the start of this church, if you remember, you go back when Paul was in jail, beaten. He had one of the greatest moves of God. So I need to be alone with God. I can't stand in security lines and long lines at the airplane. I'm a man of God. I can't do that. That's anyway. But the point is that Paul was saying that even though, he refused to do that, and the reason why is because he never wanted those things to be an obstacle. He never wanted that to be an obstacle, a hindrance to the gospel. All right. So when he says here, verse 20 again, my eager expectation and hope is that I will not be ashamed about anything, but that now, as always, with all boldness, Christ will be highly honored in my body, whether by life and death. And we're going to see a pattern here of Paul, especially, when we get into chapter 2. Paul is going to give some examples. And right here we see himself as an example. He is an example of what? The godliness. Even though the word is not used here, the word godly is a very distinct word that sets apart a lot of things. Some of you singles, how do you find a good mate in this world where there's so much self-centeredness? I think about this, that if I was single dating, man, how would, because the sinfulness, the selfishness, how would I choose a wife? Same thing. How would you choose a husband? See, everybody's into themselves. Excuse me. Social media demonstrates that. Social media, you can see that people are into themselves, big time, bigly, right? How do you know? How do you know that if you have the right motive towards God? And this word godliness is very important because so to answer the question, I would choose a godly woman. That was the one quality about my wife that more than anything else, she was a godly woman. Okay, she was a godly woman. And if you are wise, you will look first and foremost out of a person in terms of getting married. You want a godly person. If you are wise, you want a godly person. All right. So, but this thing about how do we navigate in life, one of the qualities is godliness. And notice what Paul is saying right here. Like I say, the word is not used here, but this is what he's saying. Verse 20 again, my eager expectation and hope is that I will not be ashamed by anything, but that now, as always, with all boldness, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or death. And that's, see, in other words, what he is most concerned about is godly. The word godly means a God-word attitude. I am always conscious. I am always motivated by what pleases God. That's godliness. David, though a very flawed man, was a godly person to the point that God says he's a man after my own heart. David was sitting up in his palace. God had made David great. David look, David in every aspect was the person to envy. He was a man's man, right? A warrior, a king, incredibly handsome, to the point all of David's kids were fine, pretty kids, right? Some of y'all into that, right? I want cute kids, right? David it's just if you had David's genes, you were fine, okay? David was wise. David was wealthy. Of course, he was the king. And God had made him that way. He had success. He was, in almost in every way, the one to envy. He's sitting up in his palace. Couldn't even enjoy his wealth and his success, his life, because he go, the ark of God is sitting in tents, and I sit in this palace. That's the epitome of what a godly attitude is. Couldn't even enjoy his own wealth that God gave him, that God had blessed him with, and he recognized that. But And what was ironic, too, by the way, to the story, what was ironic, that the very one thing that he wanted to do, more than anything else, he wanted to build God that temple. And God says, no, you can't build a temple. It's like, wow, what? God, I will build you a magnificent, fabulous temple. God said, no, you can't. Your son will, but you can't. So that's the irony of irony. And God, he says, well, your will be done. Your will be done. Right? So in other words, wow. He said, but God, I want to do this. And God said, no, you can't. You can't. So my point is, with godliness, right there, and that's what Paul is saying right here, that his decisions is, I don't ever want anything to reflect badly on the gospel. So that's why verse 21 he said, for me living is Christ and dying is gain. Now if I live on in the flesh, this means fruitful work for me, but I don't know which one I should choose. I am pressured by both. I have a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary for you. As I'm persuaded of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your joy and progress in the faith. Right? Verse 26. So that because of me, your confidence may grow in Christ just when I come to you again. Now, we talked about this. I won't spend too much time there. We talked about this. Was Paul talking about that, his death, that he has the power of the dead? There are some people who teach that, and that's not in the sense what Paul was talking about. That, okay, when he was saying he's torn. Remember I said earlier, why are we here? Why are we in the earth? And if your reasons is, I could have the world's delight, the world's pleasures, the world's riches, then you of all men are going to be most miserable. Because you will never, ever, ever achieve that. Paul says, my life, the purpose of my life is to serve Christ. So that's what he means when he says this here. So he says, since I decided to stay to labor with you, and I said this, that my prayer is, Lord, I want to complete the assignment that you've given me. And all of our assignments now has to do with this phrase here. Look at verse 27. Just one thing, live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Right? So whether I come and see you or I'm absent, I will hear about you that you are standing firm in one spirit, in one mind, working side by side for the faith that comes through the gospel. Look at this statement again, because we're not going to finish it tonight, but we get to it next week. Live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel. In other words, Paul says, if I remain in the flesh here, in other words, and by the way, again, like I say, we kind of got into this, whether or not, because there are some what's called faith teachings, where that teaches you that if you have enough faith, that you could make your life, you can live to be set between 70 and 120 years. And so when people die, especially the faith teachers, when the faith teachers die, or anyone else kind of die, one of the excuses that they give is that, well, in their sickness, they slipped over into glory and they saw heaven and decided to stay. Okay, and I can tell you, even some cases we use this verse that I just read, where Paul says that I'm torn between the two. Should I stay or should I go? The problem when people use this, however, is that Paul's reasoning is not there. In other words, I know, and I remember years ago, I used to even kind of say that. Years ago. I used to say, I know, because I was heavy into the faith and prosperity doctrine. I became a Christian under that teaching. So I know it well. That's why when I say that, I know it well. I know what, And I remember thinking, I don't want to go to heaven just yet, because I know I'm going to enjoy heaven. I know heaven is good. I don't want to go to heaven just yet, but I want to enjoy these blessings down here. Now, that was wrong on so many levels. In fact, I remember a pastor had even told me when I was telling him that, he said, well, first of all, your focus is wrong. Christ should be the center of everything for you. But when you go and expand on that, think of the world we're living in right now. You look, in the previous administration, one of the things that I thought about how we were brought to the brink of war, and even possibly nuclear war, because of the foolishness of leaders. That was a scary time. People don't realize, I think, how close we came to. And if that had happened, all of this, what would it mean? Think about it right now. If we go to war right now, what would getting the American dream means if you got people that's trying to destroy you? And remember, they're pushing buttons now. They're pushing buttons, and missiles are coming. You got to kind of ward off missiles. And even if they were to detonate the missiles in the sky, think about the fallout. Right? Right now, what happens in a volcano? We had one, I think, back in the 80s in Washington. I think it's Washington State, Mount Helen, right? Blew up. And you had fallout for hundreds of miles around. And as I said before, just think about this. So then, if anything, last year, COVID-19 was a sobering reminder how frail in our lives are, right? COVID-19 was a sober reminder of that. Where, especially in the early days, remember, and you didn't know if just by touching the surface, right? COVID could be on this. Now I picked this pen up. Remember, we forget sometimes, but COVID could be on this. I picked this up, and then I rub my eyes. Boom! I got COVID. That's the way everything. So people were almost scared to touch anything, right? and we're still dealing with the virus. We've learned more. We got vaccination. But we're still dealing with the threat, right? We even got the threat of maybe this thing can mutate a couple of times more where this vaccine is not. So what would happen if this thing mutates? And remember how the world, especially our nation, came to a halt? I think about rich people. Yeah, if you're gonna have to hunker down, but yeah, I would like to hunker down, being a billionaire on my 1,000-acre estate, right? But even then, guess what? Food and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, my point is, what does all this mean if you're just here? Now we'll get into this statement next time. Where am I at here? Oh, think freeze. We'll get into okay, there I go. Verse 27 again, just one thing: live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. And that's the question. Are we living our lives worthy? That is the only meaningful reason for us being here. That doesn't mean we can't enjoy life and other stuff, but if that's all you have, think about again, our lives on every level is so frail. The only meaningful reason is right here. Am I living my life worthy of the gospel? We'll get into that next week. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I'll see you next Tuesday. Okay.